This episode contains descriptions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. On the morning of August 8, 1973, a 17-year-old boy named Elmer Wayne Henley called the Houston Police Department and told the operator they needed to come right away. He had just killed a man. When officers arrived at the address, they found the body of 34-year-old Dean Arnold Corll. He was naked, lying face to the wall, his body riddled with bullet holes, through his chest, through his back, and one through his forehead. The teenager who made the call identified himself immediately as the shooter. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't invoke his rights. He said he didn't care who knew. He had to get it off his chest. What he had to say would become one of the most horrifying disclosures in American criminal history. Dean Arnold Corll was born on Christmas Eve 1939 in Waynesdale, Indiana, to a woman named Mary Arnold Corll. He had a younger brother, Stanley. From early on, the two boys were defined by contrast. Stanley was sociable and outgoing, Dean quiet and withdrawn, preferring to stay indoors rather than play with the neighborhood children. Their home was not a peaceful one. Their father was described as a man who simply did not like children. Their mother was described as overly affectionate, in a way that unsettled people who observed it. The two qualities did not balance each other out. Mary and Arnold argued constantly, and by 1946 they divorced. But their relationship didn't end there. Arnold joined the Army and was stationed in Tennessee. Mary followed with the boys, and the couple continued trying to reconcile. They remarried and divorced again. By 1950, after several more attempts to patch things back together, they parted for good. Mary took the boys to Houston, Texas. In 1953, Mary remarried a man named Jake West. They had a daughter together, Joyce. Dean was deeply protective of his little sister. Around the time Joyce was born, Mary started a small candy business out of the family garage. Dean became the delivery boy, helping his mother with the business at every opportunity. In 1958, Dean graduated from high school. The family moved to a neighborhood in northwest Houston called the Heights, a low-income area, working class, dense with children and families that had known each other for years. They opened a proper candy shop there called Pecan Palace. It was situated directly across the street from an elementary school. Dean lived in an apartment above the shop and worked there constantly. He gave free candy to neighborhood children. In the back of the shop, he set up a pool table so that kids, mostly boys, mostly in the 13 to 15 age range, would have a place to hang out. They came in droves. He was patient with them, generous, interested in their lives. Everyone in the neighborhood liked him. Nobody thought anything was wrong. At some point, a teenage male employee complained to Mary that Dean had made sexual advances toward him. Mary fired the employee. There was also a woman named Betty, an ex-girlfriend, who dated Dean for 5 years. She described him as the kindest person she had ever known. She said he was always giving things away, TVs, money, time, to anyone who needed it. She noted almost as a peculiarity that their relationship had been almost entirely physical. They hugged and kissed, but that was all. Dean had told her that sex was something reserved for marriage. In 1964, Dean was drafted into the Army. He served about 10 or 11 months before requesting a hardship discharge so he could return to Houston and help his mother with the candy shop. He was granted an honorable discharge. It was during his time in the Army and living in close quarters with other men that Dean came to understand he was gay. In June 1968, Mary closed the candy company and moved to Dallas. Dean chose to stay in Houston. He was happy there, and for the first time in his life, he was free of his mother's presence. He found work at Houston Lighting and Power Company. He had his own apartment. He had his independence. And somewhere during those years, something inside him shifted into something much darker. A boy named David Brooks first met Dean Corll in 1967 when he was in the 6th grade. David would come into the candy shop, play pool in the back, and hang around. He was a friendly, impressionable kid who responded to Dean's attention the way a lot of boys without strong fathers did, with gratitude and loyalty. They started taking fishing trips together. Dean drove him to the beach. They became inseparable. Around 1970, David's parents divorced. His mother moved to Belmont, Texas, and his father stayed in Houston. David would come to visit his father, but mostly he ended up at Dean's apartment. It was around this time that Dean began exploiting David financially and psychologically. David was around 14 years old, and Dean used that vulnerability to draw him further into his world. In 1970, a mutual friend of David's introduced him to a boy named Elmer Wayne Henley. Wayne was 14, from a broken home, with a drinking problem that was already defining his days. He started coming to Dean's parties. There were always parties. There was always alcohol, marijuana, and other substances available. Nobody in the neighborhood seemed to find it strange that a man in his 30s was hosting teenagers at his apartment on a regular basis. Dean was just like that, the friendly one, the generous one. Wayne and Dean's relationship was different from what David and Dean had. What Dean recognized in Wayne was something practical. A boy who would do almost anything for money, and who had the kind of detachment that made him useful. Because by 1970, Dean Corll had developed a hidden side that no one in the neighborhood suspected. Beneath the generosity and the open-door policy was a man who had begun pursuing something far darker, and who had decided that the boys who trusted him would become the means to act on it. He began to plan, and he began to use the people closest to him to carry those plans out. Dean's first known victim was a 20-year-old named Jeffrey Conan, who disappeared on September 25, 1970, while hitchhiking from Austin to Houston to visit his parents. He was a student at the University of Texas. David Brooks led police to his body, which was buried at High Island Beach. He had been strangled, his hands and feet bound. 3 months later, on December 15, 1970, Dean and David abducted 2 boys who had been attending a religious rally, Danny Yates, 15, and James Glass, 14. Both were strangled. Their bodies were buried at what would become Dean's primary burial site, a boat shed he rented from a woman named Mrs. Minor, which he had been leasing since November 17th of that year. The shed was large enough to hold a small yacht. There was no boat inside, and there never would be. On January 30th, 1971, Dean and David picked up 2 brothers, Donald Waldrop, 15, and Jerry Waldrop, 13, who had been on their way to a bowling alley. Their father was a construction worker building an apartment complex right next door to Dean's building. Both brothers were strangled. David said he was present when they were buried at the boat shed. On March 9, 1971, a 15-year-old named Randall Harvey was walking home after a shift at a gas station in the Heights, the same neighborhood where the candy shop had been. He was killed and buried at the boat shed. His remains weren't identified until 2008. On May 29, 1971, 2 boys were walking to a local swimming pool when Dean's white Ford van pulled up alongside them. Their names were Gregory Malley Winkle, 16, who went by Malley, and David Hillegeist, 13. Dean forced Malley to call his mother that evening and tell her they had gone to Freeport to visit friends and would be home soon. Both boys were killed and buried at the boat shed. On August 17, 1971, 17-year-old Reuben Watson was on his way to the movies when he disappeared. Like Malley, he had been made to call a parent. In his case, to say he was spending the night at David Brooks's house. He was held for hours before being killed and buried at the boat shed. It was around this time that Dean made a significant decision about Wayne Henley. Wayne had originally been brought into the circle as a potential victim, but Dean took a different kind of interest in him. He gave Wayne a test of loyalty, one that Wayne passed. From that point forward, Wayne became Dean's primary partner in luring victims. Dean paid him $200 for every boy he brought to the apartment. He didn't always pay in full. Sometimes he gave "I owe us." But Wayne kept delivering. On February 9th, 1972, a 17-year-old named Willard Rusty Branch disappeared. His father was a Houston police officer. Rusty was subjected to extreme abuse before being shot with Dean's .22 caliber pistol. He was buried at the boat shed. On March 24th, 1972, Frank Aguirre, 18, was killed and buried at High Island Beach. Frank had been engaged to a girl named Rhonda Williams, the same Rhonda who was present at the party on August 8th, 1973, the night Dean was killed. On December 22nd, 1972, a boy named Mark Scott, 18, a friend of both Wayne and David, told his parents he was going to Mexico for a few days to clear his head after a minor legal problem. A week later, his parents received a postcard, postmarked from Austin. It said he had found a good job, was making $3 an hour, and would be home when he had enough money to pay his lawyer. They never heard from him again. 6 bodies were eventually recovered from High Island Beach. Wayne always insisted there were at least 2 more buried there. Mark Scott's remains have never been found. On May 21st, 1972, 2 more boys were taken, Johnny DeLome, 16, and Billy Balch, 17. Billy had worked at the candy company and knew Dean personally. Before he disappeared, he had told his mother about going to Dean's apartment and watching TV and listening to music. He mentioned, almost casually, that Dean had once shown them some handcuffs and had put them on one of the boys, and that they had never found the key. Billy's father, a truck driver, heard this and was deeply unsettled. He said it wasn't normal for a grown man to be playing games like that with young boys. Billy's parents went to Dean's apartment after the boys disappeared. Dean answered the door, was extremely polite, and told them he had no idea where the boys had gone. Both families later received letters in their son's handwriting describing new jobs driving trucks. Johnny's mother knew immediately the letter wasn't genuine. There wasn't a single misspelled word. Billy's father knew the job described didn't exist. Both boys were killed by Wayne. Dean had subjected them to prolonged abuse before they died. They were buried at High Island Beach. On July 20th, 1972, Stephen Sickman, 17, vanished after leaving a party in the Heights. Evidence found with his remains indicated he had been severely harmed before being strangled with a nylon cord that was still around his neck when found. He was buried at the boat shed. His remains weren't positively identified until April 2011. His mother had reported him missing shortly after he disappeared. Police told her they would not investigate unless a body turned up. On October 3rd, 1972, 2 boys were taken on the same day. Wally J. Seminow, 14, was on his way to junior high when he was lured away with the promise of a party. At some point, he managed to reach his mother by phone. The call was traced to what investigators believed was Wayne's apartment, but the line went dead before he could say anything more than one word: Mama. His body was found at the boat shed. The second boy taken that day was Richard Embry, 13, who had been with Wally. Both were subdued with paint fumes and held captive. According to David Brooks, both boys were kept alive for several days before being killed and buried at the boat shed. On November 12, 1972, Richard Kepner, 19, disappeared while walking to a payphone to call his fiancée. His remains were found at High Island Beach, but were not identified until September 1983. On February 1, 1973, Joseph Lyles, 17, who lived on the same street as David Brooks, disappeared. He is believed to have been taken by Dean alone. His remains were found at Jefferson County Beach and not positively identified until 2009. On June 4, 1973, Billy Lawrence, 14, a friend of Wayne's, called his father to ask if he could go on a fishing trip with friends. His father said yes. There was no fishing trip. Billy was held by Dean for an extended period before being killed. His body was buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Ray Blackburn, 20, was a married man from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, passing through the Heights on his way home to see his newborn child. He was hitchhiking. He was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Homer Garcia, 15, had met Wayne at a local driving school. On July 7, 1973, he was killed by Dean after being held captive. He was one of the few victims killed by gunshot rather than strangulation. On July 12, 1973, 2 days before his 18th birthday, John Sellers was killed by Dean and buried at High Island Beach. He was the only victim found fully clothed. On July 19, 1973, Michael Anthony Balch, 15, disappeared. He was the younger brother of Billy Balch, killed the previous year. He was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. His remains were not positively identified until 2010. He had been misidentified as another victim for decades. That unidentified victim, believed to have been killed around August 21, 1972, has still never been named. On July 25, 1973, Marty Jones, 18, and Charles Cobble, 17, were lured to Dean's apartment with the promise of a party. They were school friends of Wayne's. Charles Cobble had a pregnant wife. Both boys were found at the boat shed. On August 3, 1973, James Drymala, 13, was last seen riding his bike in South Houston. Dean had called the boys' parents to tell them he was safe and at a party. He had lured James by asking him to help collect empty bottles for recycling. He was the last victim. When Wayne told police about the boat shed on August 8th, they were skeptical at first. They thought he was a drugged-out teenager exaggerating for attention. Then he gave them 3 names: Jones, Cobble, and Hilligeist. Jones and Cobble had only been missing 2 weeks. Hilligeist had been reported missing since 1971. All 3 were in the active files. They went to the boat shed. It was a large windowless structure, 12 feet wide, 34 feet deep, 15 feet high, big enough to hold a small yacht. Inside, among empty cardboard boxes, a stripped 1971 Chevy Camaro, several large empty water canisters marked Civil Defense Drinking Water, and cans of acrylic spray paint. They found a folded carpet with a pile of dirt in the center of it. Against one wall, a child's bicycle. It had been reported stolen 5 days earlier. It was registered to a 13-year-old boy. They began to dig. A crew of prisoners was brought in to do the work, their faces white under the August heat. After 10 or 15 minutes, they hit a layer of lime. Just below it, the smell was unmistakable. The first body was wrapped in plastic. A small blonde boy, approximately 12 or 13 years old, naked, with masking tape tightly wound around his neck, waist, and ankles. He had probably been buried about a week. They kept digging. They kept finding more. Every body was wrapped in plastic. They were at different stages of decomposition. The lime had been used to suppress the odor and slow the biological processes. Dean had visited the shed 2 to 3 times a week, according to Mrs. Miner, the owner. She had noticed a faint, unpleasant smell, but hadn't thought much of it. A neighborhood dog had sometimes been seen digging around the perimeter of the shed. In the months before his death, Dean had been asking Mrs. Miner for more room because whatever he was keeping inside had filled the space. There was no boat. There had never been a boat. A search of Dean's apartment revealed floors covered in thick plastic sheeting, a torture board 7 feet long by 3 feet wide, with handcuffs bolted to each corner, a large hunting knife, a modified radio, wired with a heavy-duty battery so that it could be played at a volume capable of drowning out screaming, ropes, multiple restraints, dildos, and thin glass rods. Wayne explained the glass rods to investigators. Dean would insert them into his victims' urethras, then shatter them, leaving broken glass inside. He occasionally castrated victims while they were still alive. At least one was found with injuries consistent with having been partially mutilated by a bite. Dean's white Ford Econoline van had blue opaque curtains blocking the rear windows. Inside, rope, carpet samples with staining, and 2 wooden crates with air holes drilled in the sides, each one small enough that a person had to double over to fit inside. In the interrogation rooms of the Houston Police Department, Wayne Henley told them everything. He didn't hold back. He described the abductions, the parties, the luring tactics, the disposal sites. He named names. He told them where to dig. He admitted to personally participating in the killing of 2 victims. He said he had helped deliver boys to Dean for payment, that Dean was happiest when there was a constant supply, and that if Wayne could have brought someone every single day, Dean would have been satisfied. David Brooks was brought in by his own father, Alton. He maintained throughout his first conversation with investigators that he had never directly killed anyone, that he had only helped lure boys to parties and helped move bodies afterward. He said he had never told anyone, not even his father. Alton sat with his son for a few minutes before David signed his confession. When Alton came back out, his shoulders were shaking. He said, "I just needed to make sure my boy never killed any human beings." He told me he didn't, and I believe him. Then he said, "I wouldn't blame the parents of these children if they came here and tried to kill me." David told police that Dean probably killed between 25 and 30 boys. He was not far off. The search extended beyond the boat shed to 2 beaches, High Island Beach and Jefferson County Beach, and to Lake Sam Rayburn. Bodies were found at all 3 locations. In total, police recovered 27 confirmed victims. All had been sodomized. Most had been strangled. Many had been tied with rope, masking tape, or nylon cord. Some had been shot. Several were identified only through DNA. Some not until 2008, 2009, 2010, or 2011. At least one remains unidentified. Wayne was insistent throughout the investigation that there were more. At least 2 additional victims buried at High Island Beach. Police called off the search on August 13, 1973, after the 27th body was recovered. That number made Dean Arnold Corll the most prolific serial killer in American history at the time, surpassing Juan Corona, who had killed 25 migrant workers buried in peach orchards in Sutter County, California. There were those who believed the search was stopped precisely because investigators didn't want the number to go higher. Former employees at the old Pecan Palace candy shop also came forward to say they had seen Dean digging on the property and covering the area with concrete. Police declined to excavate the site. The floor of that building, now a parking lot, has never been dug up. Houston police were criticized extensively for the way they had handled the missing persons reports over the preceding 3 years. Most of the boys had been classified as runaways. Families who insisted their sons would never have run away were largely dismissed. The boys had left money behind in their rooms, left their belongings, had no reason to disappear. Several had called home, under duress, words put in their mouths, in calls that convinced investigators nothing was wrong. One mother knew immediately the letter from her son was fake because he never spelled correctly. Another heard her son say only one word before the line went dead: Mama. Houston was a booming city in the early 1970s. Crime was rising faster than the police force could respond to it. The infrastructure for investigating serial predators barely existed. These are the facts. They explain the failures, but they don't diminish them. Wayne Henley was charged in 1974 with 6 murders and received 6 consecutive 99-year sentences. He was not charged in the death of Dean Corll. That killing was ruled justified self-defense. During the investigation, he reportedly mentioned to someone that he'd probably be out by 40. He remains incarcerated. David Brooks was found guilty of 1 count of murder in 1975 and received a life sentence. The case became known as the Houston Mass Murders. It made headlines across the world. The Pope offered a statement of condolence to the victims' families. Dean Arnold Corll killed at least 27 young men and boys, nearly all of them from a single neighborhood in Houston, Texas, over a period of roughly 3 years. He was aided by 2 teenagers who grew up in the same streets as the victims, knew their names, had their trust, and handed them over for money and for reasons that still resist easy explanation. He died on the floor of his own house, shot 6 times by a boy who had spent years helping him, and then finally, on one August night, decided not to anymore. The last thing Dean said was, "You're not going to do it." He was wrong.